Rosa Hill hadn't flown in a very long time. Therefore, she was experiencing a significant amount of anxiety before boarding the plane. At first, she got a bit confused and didn't understand where exactly she needed to go in a huge airport. Everyone was in a hurry, and no one paid attention to the old woman, who froze in indecision in the middle of the airport. Rosa Hill grew up in a rural town in northern Iowa. She had flown on an airplane a long time ago when she was a child, and her parents were still alive and took her places. Since then, a lot of time has passed, and Mrs. Hill's life changed beyond recognition. She lived through everything, joy and sorrow, happiness and the bitter sting of disappointment. All these moments made her life kind of a kaleidoscope of memories that she kept in her head. As she tried to find the gate she needed, Mrs. Hill kept stopping passersby and asking them for directions. Finally, fortune smiled upon the old woman in the form of a young man who took her by the hand and led her to the registration desk. Mrs. Hill was supposed to fly business class, which surprised the airline employee who was checking her in. "You're fortunate, ma'am. A flight to New York in business class. It's going to be a nice trip," the young woman said with a smile as she pointed the old woman to her gate. Mrs. Hill thanked the airport employee for her help. Time passed very slowly. In fact, the old woman felt like it was standing still. Finally, it was boarding time. As the passengers boarded the aircraft, a flight attendant greeted them on behalf of the airline. The passengers headed to the aircraft through the boarding bridge. After checking the boarding passes, the flight attendant gave detailed instructions as to where each passenger was supposed to sit. It turned out that Mrs. Hill had a window seat, which made the old woman incredibly happy. She wanted to have the opportunity to look at the world from such a great height that the houses would seem like small dots, and the rivers and roads like tiny threads. Since no one was sitting next to her, the old woman relaxed noticeably and began to mentally prepare herself for the flight. Then she took out a smartphone from her pocket and quickly began to type something into the search bar. But Mrs. Hill didn't have time to complete the task. A woman who looked about 30 years old burst into the business class. She held an elegant handbag in one hand and a tablet in the other. From the woman's appearance and behavior, one could tell that she belonged to the financial elite. She most likely occupied a senior position in some large company or even a governmental institution. By a cruel twist of fate, the woman's seat was right next to Mrs. Hill's. This caused the old woman's anxiety to skyrocket. Plopping down next to her, the stranger gave Mrs. Hill a contemptuous look. Then she publicly declared, "Why should I sit next to this old hag? Was there really no other place on the plane? And what is she doing in business class anyway?" Rosa Hill blushed deeply and lowered her eyes in embarrassment. Although her clothes looked clean and tidy, they of course were not in line with the current fashion trends. The flight attendant heard the young woman's disgruntled words and approached her. "Oh, what happened, miss? Is there an issue?" she asked sympathetically. "Issue? How do you even have the audacity to ask me such a thing? Of course there's an issue if I'm made to sit next to this stinky old hag. I'm Pamela Phillips. I have extensive connections among the leadership of the city." Pamela answered much louder than was necessary, letting everyone know that she was an important person. The flight attendant mustered up all of her willpower to politely tell Mrs. Phillips that Mrs. Hill had purchased a ticket just like she did and had every right to sit there. Of course, the old woman had every right to be in business class during the flight. "But that's not right. Shouldn't you have some kind of dress code? Or do you simply not care who you let into business class?" You could tell by the flight attendant's facial expression that she had exhausted her ability to explain the situation patiently or politely and simply didn't know what else to do. All the while, Mrs. Hill didn't participate in the argument. She sat silently and continued to look out the window. The flight was delayed. Pamela used the extra time to try and achieve her goal by whatever means possible. She continued to humiliate the old woman sitting next to her, expecting the other business class passengers to support her. At some point, Mrs. Hill was so tired of Pamela's abuse that she decided to get up and head to the economy class. The old woman no longer cared about the wasted money. All she wanted was to get out of that horrible situation by any means possible. But just as Mrs. Hill was about to leave her seat, a young pilot entered the cabin and headed straight for Pamela Phillips. Pamela immediately gave the captain a grateful smile, thinking that he would solve her problem with the annoying old woman in one fell swoop. But when the pilot got closer, he turned to Mrs. Hill first. He said, "We apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am. We are sincerely sorry." "Why are you apologizing to her? I'm the one who deserves an apology. You're all mixed up," said Pamela, getting visibly more upset. The pilot shook his head disappointedly, after which he asked Pamela to leave the aircraft. Needless to say, Pamela was truly shocked. After all, she had absolutely no doubt that she was in the right. But the pilot was adamant. "In order to avoid future conflict, I insist that you get on another flight to get to your destination. Just look at what's happening here. A decent person is getting kicked out of business class. I will definitely be filing a complaint, do you hear me?" shouted Pamela as she was being escorted by 2 flight attendants. As soon as the quarrelsome woman left the plane, the passengers breathed a sigh of relief. The pilot returned to the cockpit and began preparing for departure. A few minutes later, the plane sped along the runway and finally took off. Rosa Hill looked out the window and smiled at her reflection in the glass. She was flying to New York on a very important business, which couldn't be delayed. In the meantime, Pamela Phillips was booking a ticket for another flight. She had no idea how much her life was going to change because of that incident. She learned the hard truth only when she arrived to New York and people started pointing fingers at her. Still not realizing what was happening, Pamela approached a taxi stand where she was immediately recognized. "Look, that's the woman who made a scene on the plane," one of the taxi drivers said as he pointed. Pamela was genuinely bewildered. "Wait, how do you know about what happened? As far as I remember, you weren't there," Pamela remarked irritably. The taxi driver laughed. Without saying a word, one of them took out his phone and showed Pamela a video in which she humiliated the other business class passenger. The video was uploaded only a few hours ago and became viral almost instantly. It made Pamela famous, showing the whole world her quarrelsome nature. How did it happen? Did the old woman film me on her phone in secret during the confrontation? Pamela wondered to herself. This realization plunged Pamela into a state of deep shock. But the most interesting thing was yet to come when she arrived to a meeting with her boss. To Pamela's surprise, her boss's executive assistant did not let Pamela enter the office and also announced that she was fired, effective immediately. Only then did Pamela realize what a grave mistake she had made by humiliating an innocent woman. Pamela was so used to dividing people into the rich and the poor that she did not notice the moment when she lost her humanity and empathy. The biggest shock came to Pamela when she realized that Rosa Hill wasn't some miserable old woman who scrimped and saved to have enough money for a business class ticket to New York. In fact, it was Mrs. Hill who belonged to the financial elite and had an 8-figure net worth. The woman did not like to show off and preferred to dress in simple, everyday clothes and behaved like an ordinary, elderly woman. As a widow, Rosa Hill devoted all of her free time to philanthropy, which became her meaning in life. She helped children in the foster care system and animals experiencing homelessness. She spent huge sums of money so that underprivileged people could feel cared for and supported. In parallel, the woman had a vlog in which she covered the most topical issues. Thanks to the vlog, Pamela Phillips went viral after Mrs. Hill filmed her on the plane. Despite her impressive capital and position in society, the old woman hated flying more than anything, and so she avoided it. But one day, she got tired of being limited by her phobia. She decided to try and overcome her fear by taking a flight to New York, where she planned on starting a new charitable foundation. Unfortunately, it was then that the elderly woman was disrespected by Pamela Phillips, who thought that she could look down at the old woman. Pamela's viral video once again proves that people should not judge each other by their looks or the size of their wallets. Real kindness is often modest and awaits us where we least expect it.